Good evening and welcome to our second in the series with Cohen Publishing, Mizrahi and Cohen, 6 fascinating, and welcome to our second in the series. We look forward to another fascinating discussion interview tonight with the second of our speakers. This week I'm delighted to have with us Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, the professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University, who has written a remarkable book, Ani Maamin, which we're going to discuss tonight. One of the chapters of that book is how the Torah broke from political thought. But I really want to discuss with him so many of the areas this book brings and to the wider Jewish world tonight. So I'd like to welcome now Rabbi Berman to the studio from Bet Shemesh, Israel. Welcome, Rabbi Berman. Lovely to have you with us.
Good evening, Rabbi Shaw, and good evening, listeners in the UK.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, it is 10:30 in Israel, so thank you for staying up to join us tonight. By the time we finish, the sun's still not set here. We're in the heart of the summer, which means sunset here is about 9:30, Shabbat 10:30. So, but it's not Scotland, where Shabbat goes at 11:30, so we can be spared that. But in essence, tonight is very exciting for me because I've wanted to talk to you ever since I read your wonderful book, because it really was such an eye-opener in so many different ways. How you really explored many areas I think many modern Jews have really grappled with over the last few decades in terms of modern scholarship as well as faithfulness to the Torah. The first question really is, what drove you to write this book about biblical criticism, about sort of contemporary ideas and problems with the Torah's narrative, all these sort of challenging areas? Why this and why now?
Right. So I'll say by way of beginning, I recall about 30 years ago when I was learning in the Gush at Yeshivat Har Etzion, and I remember that it was rumored that there were several fellows in the yeshiva who were interested in biblical criticism, and I thought to myself, how do they even know what that is? How would they even read about that? To do that, they would have to get on a bus and travel to Yerushalayim and find a big library and then find the books. And that just seems like an enormous effort. And the way we are today is just the opposite. Rather than having to go very far to find things about biblical criticism, it comes right at you through your screen. And all of us, because we're all inundated, whether you are looking for it or not, you will eventually find online, because people are talking about the origins of the Bible and the claims, and is it historically accurate, and is it filled with inconsistencies? And therefore, because of the internet, is just something that we all encounter. And it's not just you and I, Rabbi Shaw, as adults, midlife. It is more and more younger people, and it's before they even finish secondary school. They are encountering these claims. Not even when they go off to university and they're told about biblical criticism. They don't need to go to university anymore to hear about biblical criticism. And I recall about 10 years ago, I was asked to be part of kind of a think tank of religious Zionist educators, teachers, professors, to come to terms with all these issues of biblical criticism. And I thought, this is going to be great. We're going to roll up our sleeves, and the 10 or 12 of us are going to brainstorm and think about ways of putting out approaches that would help people bridge this gap. And I was just appalled by what I saw, because what I saw was that most of the mechanchim there, most of the educators, very prominent rabbanim, very prominent teachers, but who were not themselves trained in this field academically, their starting position to me seemed to be, well, if academics say so, that must be true. And now we have to figure out, how do we sort of bend over backwards and make the handmaiden of the Masorah, of the tradition, bow down to the master of the university. And for me, sitting in the university and trained in these fields, going to the conferences, reading the journals, I know, no. We can do much better than that. There's an awful lot of what is projected as total truth from the university about these issues. There's a lot of speculation. There are many sides to many things. And because more and more people were becoming interested, and I would say troubled, by these questions, I took upon myself 10 years ago to try to do something with it academically, which I did. I've written 2 books about the Torah through Oxford University Press.
Right.
And now to put out a version of that material for our community. And let me say, Rabbi Shaw, that I've always been impressed. Per capita, the number of traditional Jews in the UK who are concerned about these issues is much greater than in the United States. And this is because there's a dogged commitment it's in the British intellectual tradition to be concerned with evidence, to be concerned with things that make sense rather than, mystical approaches to things. And so it's always been a pleasure to speak, especially with my British friends, about these issues.
I mean, I think it's true. I think, obviously there was many, later we might get on to the difference between America and the UK. But I think for sure here we have a very strong intellectual tradition and we have questions and we're not afraid to ask those questions. And again, this is point behind it. If anyone has any questions for you after these discussions, please can they just message us and we will make sure you get those questions as well. But I want to kick with really something that was, I guess, the major thesis of your book, which was to understand and recognize that the Torah, the divine Torah written by Hashem, was written at the time of when it was written, meaning a lot of the words that have had meaning is because it's based on the Near East civilizations that were around at the time in the 13th and 14th century BCE. And therefore the question, and I hope you come back because you're going to have to answer this question because I don't know the answer. The question, which I hope you can hear me.
Back? Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
You hear me?
I'm back.
Okay,
yeah,
good.
Yeah.
Sorry
about that. Yeah.
The question really is, you're saying in the book, or certainly the first part of the book, that it was written for that time, which is why so many things kind of make sense now because it was written for that time. Therefore, do we understand that concept for how it can be meaningful and relevant for the 21st century? Because in essence, can it both?
Sure. So this approach that we need to understand as much as we can about the ancient Near East in order to better understand the Torah is an approach that was laid out first not by biblical scholars but by the Rambam. The Rambam makes a very big point of this. In fact, he pines at the end of the Guide to the Perplexed. He says, I wish that I knew more about the ancient Near East, because the more that I would know, the more that I would understand. Now, this does raise, of course, the question, wait a minute, but isn't the Torah an eternal document? Doesn't it speak to all ages? And why is it that in some of the mitzvot, and as I try to argue, some of its literary conventions are also rooted in that time? Can't God speak to everyone at the same time? I mean, isn't he, after all, God? And so my answer to this is the following. The first is that there's no way for the Ribono Shel Olam to express himself in a way that would be as immediate, as full for all peoples in all times. That's not because of a limitation on God. That's because of a limitation of mankind.
Yeah.
And what counts as aesthetics, good music, good writing for British sensitivities is not necessarily for what's American sensitivities, let alone anyone's sensitivities 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. But getting to your question, Rabbi Shaw, about, but aren't the values, aren't the teachings of the Torah itself, aren't those eternal? And my answer here is that we need to look at the Torah, that Hashem's word is not the final word, it is the first word. And we can see this within the Torah itself. You can see, for example, just to look across our tradition, when you find that we have a mitzvah of Yibum, the levirate marriage, where in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Chaf Hei, the Torah says that when a man dies and they didn't have children, that his wife should remarry one of the deceased's brothers. And through this, they will rebuild the family name, the name of the deceased. And it sounds like a really big mitzvah. And then you see that Megillat Ruth you can say that this is a book devoted entirely to the importance of this one mitzvah, of performing the mitzvah, which in one form or another is what Boaz does with Ruth. And yet you see that later on in the tradition, in rabbinic times, the rabbis turn everything on its head. And they say it's actually better for the brother to do chalitza, to back out of the marriage rather than marrying the woman herself. And the reason they do this is because over time things changed. And whereas in the Torah, it was still permissible. No one saw anything askance with polygamy, with having multiple wives. But as you go through the Tanakh itself, that changes. And as you go into Chazal, that changes as well. There is always an expectation, even within the Torah, that times will change, and that with it, the mitzvot, the way in which they are performed, will change as well. You even see the way in which the mitzvah of Yibum changes. What Boaz does with Ruth is not exactly what the Torah says in Dvarim Chafei. And what Chazal say in Masechet Yevamot seems to turn certain things on their head. Now, this might be threatening for some, but wait a minute, aren't these things all absolute? But the truth is that the whole notion of a Torah Sheba'al Peh, that's given over to the rabbis, to the chachamim of every age, to learn out new drashot, is part and parcel of the way in which the Torah was always meant to be learned. That is to say, that the Torah itself gives, I would say, a vector, a kind of an indication of the overarching values that we want, but their actual implementation within the Torah, within the Tanakh, within Chazal, is a constantly changing and evolving endeavor, because times change, and therefore the balance between various values will change as well.
But you make it sound like that's a controversial view. I mean, I remember reading Rav Chaim Shmulevitz talks about the whole Choni HaMagal story. Why did Choni in the Gemara wanted to die? He could have, the fact that he didn't have relevance anymore in that generation, because his Torah is no longer the Torah of the generation, because he'd been asleep for 70 years. And I think, therefore, it's always been in the Shafet B'Yamav. I think this is such an important idea. And I think part of the frustration I think we have maybe in the Mizrahi world is that we have on both sides sort of people who sort of reject the modern world and are tremendously strong in Torah. The other side who reject Torah and are very much part of the modern world. And there needs to be this kind of connection to both the Torah we're living and the modern world, or whatever. And the modern world is always the modern world, because it's whatever generation you're in, that's the modern world. The Rambam was modern for Ibn Ezra, it's now modern for us. So I think that's a very, powerful and beautiful and important idea. You mentioned something in the book, which when I read it, kind of especially what's happening at the moment in America and here as well, you said the word culture wars, which is big headlines now across the world, because of course Donald Trump said we're in a culture war and so on and so forth. And even here, there's a lot of cancel cultures happening here in the UK It really seems to be this, but you were talking in the fact of the way I think the line you said, you could tell how somebody voted in a US presidential election based on their views about biblical criticism.
Sure. I love academics. I love it. I grow so much from it. They're really brilliant people who do wonderful things. But there's, the world of the academy is situated in the world that we live in. And what I mean by that is, if you allow me to use an American paradigm, in America, there are individuals that watch Fox News, and there are individuals that read the New York Times, and never the twain shall meet. People are kind of functioning in their own, in the fishbowl of their own first assumptions, in their own little echo chambers. And it turns out that very often academics and Bible scholars are doing the same sort of thing, and it influences the work that they do, sometimes subliminally in ways that they're not able to follow. And the line that I had in the book that you were referring to is that I see on the question of, was there an exodus? Did the exodus really happen? Now, one would think that one should just, lay on the table all the bits of evidence, weigh them with the rules that we have about what constitutes strong evidence and weak evidence, and we should all come to a consensus. But unfortunately, what I've seen is that I'm speaking now of American scholars. I'm not up enough on the British scholars on this, but in terms of American scholars, you can see pretty clearly those that believe that there was an exodus have voted fairly consistently for one part of the United States. And those that believe that there was no exodus consistently vote for another party in the United States. Now, 2020 will be a very interesting test as to whether that still holds true because of who is currently sitting in the White House. But I suspect we're not meant to talk politics here on your program.
No, I think
Yes, I will conclude with that part of the analogy. But this is true, and it's true in many, many other areas of biblical scholarship as well. People come to the table with who they are. and it impacts. I don't want to give chas v'chalila, God forbid, the impression that it's all a sold game from the beginning, and everyone is coming with an agenda. I don't think that that's true, but there certainly are times where you can see where people come with their backgrounds, they come with their orientations, they come with their proclivities.
Now, the book you've written obviously deals with biblical criticism, deals with a lot of, and we're going to get into some of the other challenging ideas that you mentioned. And obviously, having read some of the stuff, obviously it's quite different. Even though, of course, as you rightly said, it's not your original thoughts; it's based on based on other wonderful scholars. But what's been the response in both the, I hate the term, orthodox world to the right, I guess is I don't know what I always hate saying the word ultra. I think that's the wrong word. The Haredi world, I guess you would say, in Israel, in America, and what's been the view of the, I guess, sort of scholarly world, sort of secular scholarly world of what you've written? Because obviously you've made everyone curious, or you made everyone kind of like, I don't know, what's been the reaction?
Right. So when I was writing this, Rabbi Shaw, I was convinced that this book had something in it to offend everyone. I discuss issues of the 13 principles of faith and lay out many positions that we have in our Masorah that are not normally taught. And I thought, that's going to get, people on the right are just not going to put up with hearing that there are other voices or how those work out or different understandings than what they have. And at the same time, in my book, I totally diss the documentary hypothesis and our very capacity to, quote unquote, find the original sources of the Torah or of the Tanakh or of any ancient document. And I thought, oh well, people on the left are just going to say, oh, he's a rabbi. That's totally apologetics. And Rabbi Shaw, it's been 4 months, and I haven't heard the criticism on either side. Okay. Now let me just give a little caveat about that. Let me speak about the reception on the right, the more yeshivish world.
Yeah.
What I said before about how everyone's exposed to biblical criticism these days, it's true for that world as well. With all the talk of, oh no, we can't have internet in the house. There's plenty of internet, and when it's not in the house, it's in the yeshiva and it's in the library, and people are aware of the questions. And because most Jews, I think, are intellectually honest, they know, if there's a problem here, then my conscience is standing on my shoulder as a little figure saying, something's wrong. You got to sort this out. And so when I managed to present approaches and show that they're rooted, these ways of thinking may not have been the way that you and I were taught in yeshiva, let alone when we were little youngsters. But here are the sources. Look what the Rambam says. Look what Rav Sadia Gaon says. Look what the Ralbag says, and on and on and on. Then people say, wow, well, I guess, this is new, but it's rooted, and it doesn't seem to jostle or to go against any classical doctrine. So this is maybe a very significant way, and it seems to have academic standing if it's written by a guy who's had 2 books published by Oxford University Press on the Torah, and he's a professor and all that stuff. And so I've been very pleasantly surprised by the number of people on the right. I've gotten emails from one woman wrote me from London. She says, I live in a Hasidic community, and I bought your book, and I'm passing it around to a book club that we have of other Hasidic women here in London. I had a Zoom meeting with 5 guys who live in Williamsburg. They're Satmar Hasidim, and they look like Satmar Hasidim. And they read the book, and they wanted to talk about it, and on and on. And I've had emails from graduates of the Mir and Lakewood and Gateshead. Now, this is not to say that in the Lakewood or in Gateshead that on every stender you will find a copy of Ani Maamin. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think that there are people who are aware and who are looking for this type of approach. Now, on the other side, how have academics responded? So this book is a distillation of the academic version of this presentation, which came out 3 years ago through Oxford, called Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention, and the Limits of Source Criticism. Now, here's where things get interesting, okay? That book has been reviewed 15 times. All of the reviews have been positive.
Oh, really? Because you really do have quite source criticism.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I slaughter all the sacred cows. Okay, but I will tell you, Rabbi Shaw, that the fact that 15 reviews have been published and they've all been positive is bad news. That's bad news. Why is that bad news? Normally authors are pleased when there are so many reviews and they're all positive. It's bad news because, Rabbi Shaw, it goes back to what I said before. People are functioning inside their own fishbowls of first assumptions. And when you have people who are doggedly committed to the documentary hypothesis or to the belief that we can, with high resolution, recreate the various stages at which a biblical text evolved to the point that we get to the received text that we have, and along comes Berman and says, that's just fundamentally flawed on so many basic levels, and here they are, as I show, nine different methodological flaws in what scholars do with their parade example, flood story. Then rather than fighting back, they just ignore it. It's kind of like this and this and this, and that's very sad. That's very sad. But it's not just Berman that they do this. They accuse one another of doing this too. This is part of why what goes on in the university is not always as holy as we might have thought. Again,
No, I'm very happy to hear, as you said, in the Hasidic and the Haredi communities, how they've really engaged with you about these. Because again, I said some. But there's one thing I want to kind of expand on as well. Something you said which made me think in terms of in the book. You were speaking about how a lot of these things couldn't have been known, at the time of the documentary hypothesis, couldn't have been known when, the rabbis of the Middle Ages or were writing stuff that only recently has come to light because of scientific and other discoveries. And you spoke about how good, you said, you managed to find X, Y, and Z that have allowed you, to do it. So, and I think we can look at the world really, the Jewish world certainly, post 48. It's a new world in terms of what's happened to Jewish people. So much of our literature was written in exile, and now we've come back to the land. Now, there's an unbelievable explosion of Torah in the land of Israel. How do you, in terms of what you're uncovering now, what you're discussing now, and the whole way of, looking at the world in a different way, post 48 and post 67, to realize that, maybe there is a revolution needed in the way, I think Rav Kook certainly was one of the first to see that there was something happening and something new was happening to Jewish people, and positive, not in a negative way. So with the whole sort of way that this thesis has come out of the modern discoveries, how do you feel? And I think you mentioned as well how it's so different in Israel in terms of the Zionism versus modern Orthodoxy in America. This whole kind of way of looking at the world and looking at Torah and looking at sort of how we lived in the 21st century. To bring it all together, how do you see sort of what's happened in the Zionist or religious Zionist stream in terms of the work you've been doing?
Well, I think that just by the nature of things, there's a greater interest in Tanakh and Tanakh study here in Eretz Israel than there might be in the diaspora. That's just part of being here and part of the rebirth of the Jewish people. I think also that there is there's somewhat of a greater openness, I would say, to reading non-religious approaches to the Bible by non-religious scholars, and maybe even a more expanded way of thinking about some of the more contentious issues that come from biblical criticism. And let me explain why that is. As I'm sure you're well aware, it's especially true in the UK and it's true in the US as well. The kind of place that is occupied by, let's say, Yeshivat University or rabbis that might be affiliated with Mizrahi in the UK, there's always a sense of a threat from the left and a threat from the right.
Yeah.
Threat from the left can be liberal, conservative, it can be Louis Jacobs, it can be open orthodoxy, whatever you want to call it. And so if someone who is affiliated with our world, and I'm putting you and me together here, espouses a view about Torah or about any of these hotbed questions from biblical criticism, then immediately you run the risk of being accused of, oh, so you're really with all those liberals on the left who we don't want to be a part of because we don't really view them as fully authentic. And so people are very hesitant to explore these issues out loud. And then you run the risk of being clobbered from the right, because when someone does say something that might be a little bit different than what the classical explanations are of things, then those on the right say, oh, well, you see what's going on there? Those Mizrahi Rabbanim, they're no different than all those liberal Rabbanim. And when you have the type of situation where our children are trying to decide which brand of orthodoxy they might want, and they want something that's authentic, and they say, well, I'm really going to go off to the right because they're clearly more authentic, then there's always competition going on here. And so I think that thinkers and leaders within the rabbinic world, our rabbinic world, in the diaspora, are constantly looking to their left and to the right. That's just their reality. But in Israel, it isn't that way at all. You see, in Israel, there is no threat from the left as a religious threat. There's no reform, conservative. There's no open orthodoxy. And to the right, well, there certainly is a very large yeshivish world, but it's so far to the right.
Exactly.
There's no notion of, oh my gosh, we will lose adherence to we're competing for the same groups. No, it's different planets. And so it allows thinkers here, I think, to sometimes come up with some wider views of things. Let me just give two examples of this, okay? As you well know, Rabbanit Chana Henkin, who I had the privilege of working with for 12 years when I was teaching at Nishmat, founded the program called the Yoatzot Halacha. These are women who are trained to answer a whole range of questions in the area of Taharat HaMishpacha. Now, had she tried to set that up in the U.S. at YU, no way. People said, oh, you're making rabbis. We're just not going there. We're not going there. But in Israel, she was able to do it because when she said, this is not about, agendas or politics, this is merely about Kiyum HaMitzvot, observing the commandments, and Shalom Bayit, peace in the home, full stop. She was believed, and she was able to set it up in Israel, and then it's now taken hold in different communities all over the diaspora. So this is an area of something that was sensitive, women as postcode, basically, that was able to start precisely in Israel and only then move out to the diaspora. Or just another example, as you may know, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who recently passed away, he spearheaded recently, a few years ago, a movement to alleviate a growing problem here in Israel, the problem of intermarriage. The problem of intermarriage here in Israel is not the same as the problem of intermarriage in the UK or the US. When I say intermarriage here, I mean that 30 years ago, we brought over 1 million Russians, and some of them were halakhically Jewish, and a good number of them were not halakhically Jewish. And when their children now marry Israelis who are Vatikim, who had been here for many years, halachically, folks, that's an intermarriage, okay? And 5%, a full 5% annually of marriages in this country are these forms of intermarriage. And so Rav Rabbi said, we have to find a way to get all these Russians who've now been here for a generation, who speak Hebrew, who serve in the army, who for all intents and purposes see themselves as part of the Jewish people. We have to find a way to get them on board. And so he revisited many serious sources that discussed what is the level of Kabbalat mitzvot, of accepting the mitzvot that you need to have in order to convert. And this has now paved the way for many people to join the fold of the Jewish people. But it is a lower level than has been in practice, let's say, for the past 100 or 150 years. This could never have been done abroad. People would have said, you're caving into the left. But there is no left here.
The whole point is that's a brilliant case, because the whole point, I think, there is the Jewish people haven't had this for 2,000 years. We haven't had a question of having somebody growing up in the Jewish homeland, speaking Hebrew, immersed. Again, I think so much of what you said in your book as well was we've got to go back to common law, not and how it used to be. And I think a lot of the frustration of maybe within the modern Jewish world is how our Judaism is very much being shaped by what happened in persecuted Russia and Poland, rather than kind of what Cook was talking about, kind of seeing it in we're coming back, returning to what it used to be, Chadesh Yemenu Kedem kind of idea. So I think, again, you raised, which I wanted to follow up on, I think I didn't ask you this. You mentioned, of course, in Israel, there isn't, in the same way like in America, a strong reform or conservative. Obviously, this type of book, which is serious about its scholarship in terms of not shying away from the issues that really should concern anybody who's just thinking rashly about the Torah, have Reform Jews said to you, or Reform rabbis come to you and said, you know what, this is really made me rethink my relationship to Torah in terms of, I thought Orthodoxy was completely unscholarly, completely fundamentalist, and
I'll tell you what's made them rethink. I have received letters of thanks from people whose smicha are from liberal streams in the U.S. And what I've discovered is that a lot of these people also they really would rather, they want to believe that much of the Masorah is true, but they don't want to compromise on what they interpret as intellectual truth. And so when I come along and say, you know what, I'm going to give you an intellectually true basis through which you can affirm that there was an Exodus, through which you can affirm that the Torah is a divine text, they're thrilled. They don't come and say, no, we believe in J, P, E, and D, not Torah. No, they're happy to hear that there's a way to do things otherwise, at least the ones that have reached out to me.
Again, one of the things I've always said is I can't do it in this country. I'd love to go and go into a reform shul here and stand up and say, you know what, you want to do something that is modern and relevant. Well, so do I. I think so much of our damage we've done is that people, unfortunately, again, we have in England something called the United Synagogue, which is a wonderful organization. Allowed us to keep the majority of people within the Orthodox fold. I think so many of them just think, well, if I'm religious, I have to be X, look like X, Y, and Z. They don't even think that you can actually be cultural and scientific and musical and all these things as part of what Torah is. And I think that's why these books are so important and so relevant to what challenges. And you mentioned as well, nowadays, because of the Google Rebbe, everyone knows everything. And I think it's so important that we aren't scared to deal with the real, challenging issues, which I think you bring up. And again, maybe it's going over. The book is so remarkable to read, and I recommend everybody to go and get a copy of it. But I think for me, the really one that hit home was the way you analyzed the Exodus, and that whole idea of, something that we've learned from such a young age, and the idea of the amount of people that left Egypt, and the 600,000, the 2 million people. And I remember as a kid, even as a smicha, even as a rabbi, thinking it's a pretty big PR job to do and an organization job to do and everything. And I just thought, well, it was miracles. And what you've done is said, not look at actually what classical sources said about these areas and really open a whole different way of looking at a classic story, which doesn't take away the divinity of the Torah in one little bit, but allows us as people who actually want the Torah to make sense to our modern sort of sensibility. It really is. So again, the area of that area in terms of the 600,000, just take us through briefly sort of what's the idea within Torah, within sort of classic thought that can say it's not literally 600,000 people, but just a concept of numbers.
Okay, one of the underlying assumptions about the book, and this is the thing that I find the most fun about the work that I do as an academic, is when you discover something that just seems to us to be so obvious that everybody throughout history must have thought exactly the same way, and then you discover that it's not true. And that there are a wide range of concepts that we just assume are universal and have always been that way that are not. For example, the word, the term, the words, fact, fiction, history, law, politics, religion, belief. None of these words exist in biblical Hebrew. None of these words exist in rabbinic Hebrew. And this tells us that conceptually, they understood each of these issues very differently. They are not universal. They were not always assumed to mean exactly the same things that we do. One of the things that also falls into this category is how people relate to numerical figures. When we read a text and it says a number, we're like, it's exactly that. It's exactly that, because all the numbers that we encounter today in our modern world are precise. It is exactly, 30 degrees centigrade outside. The exchange rate today is exactly, 4 point whatever it is, and on and on and on. Numbers that we encounter are always literal. And what happens in ancient Near Eastern writings, and what you can demonstrate in the Torah, is that so often numbers are serving symbolic purposes. It cannot be understood any other way. Okay, and I bring several examples of this, and then demonstrate how this is the only way that we can really understand the numbers that are in Sefer Bamidbar, that are about the 600,000 male fighters between 20 and 60 years of age. Just to give one, because I know leaving people hanging like, what? No,
Exactly.
no. So let
That's
me
why when
just
I started reading, I was like, what? But then I read. And...
Right. Let me give just one small example. Friends at home, here's a one-question quiz to you. When Yaakov Avinu went down to finally reunite with Yosef, how many Jews, how many descendants of Yaakov Avinu went down to Egypt? How many? You're right, 70. I assume that's what you said. And that's probably what you said because that's what the Torah says. It says that at least 2 or 3 times in Breshit Memvav. Shivim Nefesh that went down. And not only does it say 70, it gives you all the names. So if you had any doubt that there was 70, here are all the names. Okay? Here are all the names. Okay? So there seems to be no, it's open and shut. There were 70. All right, maybe 69, there's a name that's missing, but 69 or 70, maybe Yaakov is the 70th. But already the Netziv of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, the biggest yeshiva in all of Europe at the end of the 19th century, he writes in his commentary, it wasn't 70. I know it says 70. I know it gives all 70 names. It wasn't 70. And the reason he says this is that because the Psukim beforehand say that this list will include all of Yaakov's sons and grandsons and daughters-in-law and granddaughters. And when you look at this whole list of 70, you see exactly the names of 2 women. And so that means that if it's a literal list and those were the only ones that went down, it is just unthinkable that there were only 2 women. And those girls must have had an amazing field of shidduchim available to them if it was just 2 women. And so he says that it must be symbolic. In the book, he gives some suggestions. I try to show that all the numbers that are there, there's a whole play of numbers in that section that demonstrate to us that clearly there's all sorts of encoded symbolism in the numbers that are referred to there, and that clearly it could not have been 68 men and 2 women. That's just one example. I give several other examples and then show how this is. It must
but again, the idea is
I
want people to buy the book now. They're going to be so intrigued by how could it be. So I recommend everybody read that chapter or the whole book itself. We actually had a question from one of our listeners, one of our viewers, I guess it would be. Shmuel Frankel, I'll read this question to you. It says, to the modern reader, the Torah seems to reflect what he would consider a primitive value system, one which approves slavery, etc. Why couldn't God introduce man to a more advanced moral system? So
Right. Okay. So here I am reminded of the first girl that I dated.
Okay.
She had a mantra. She used to say, "Be reasonable. Be like me." And well, it didn't really work out because it's not reasonable to expect someone to be like you all the time. And I would say to this question, I have a chapter in the book where I show how the Torah really broke with ancient political thought in just a huge number of terms of how it viewed political power, political it viewed, it viewed economic policy, a whole economic form that has many aspects to it, far exceeded or far predated their reappearance in political and economic. At the same time,
just wait. Your internet, I can't really hear you at the moment, so just wait till it kind of clears again.
Okay, how are we doing now?
It's kind of only getting a second one. It's a very important answer. I want to make sure that people hear what you're saying.
Okay, all right. We're better now?
Yeah, I think we're back. Okay, try. Sorry.
Okay, right. And I would say what I think the Rambam would say, which is, we're talking about people with an ancient mindset, and only so far the Torah speaking to that generation could take them. This goes back to what I said before. The words that we have in the Torah Shebichtav are the first word, not the final word. Right? Just like the Torah seems to permit polygamy, right? Yaakov Avinu had 4 wives, but the Tanakh itself moves on in time, and Chazal move on in time. And so I think it's the same thing also with questions like slavery, especially when we're speaking about Jewish slavery. Yes, it uses the word eved, but when you see what the Torah says about it, and certainly when we see what the Halakha says about it, it's really just a way to pay back one's debt. But again, there should be no expectation that the social world that the Torah creates is the ideal blueprint for all time. Rather, one should look at what were the types of reforms that the Torah did relative to what existed elsewhere.
I mean, massive difference. I mean, again, as you said in one of your chapters, complete revolution at that time and place of what the world was like. For the next 1,000 years, it was a revolution. The next 2,000 years, it was still a revolution. Which I think is a I mean, again, that's part of, I think, what is absolutely remarkable about when you read your book and you realize, yes, it was written incredibly powerfully for the generation that received it, but it's still incredibly relevant for every generation from then and onwards, which is the why divine document, because no human being would be able to work that out in the way.
Just to make things concrete for our viewers, Montesquieu was a political theorist, said that it is very important that judges receive their appointment from the people, not from the king, not from other judges, but from the people. And he said this because it's important that the people have faith that the judges are doing true justice for the people who appoint them, that is, the people who are being judged themselves. This was the first time in history that anyone had thought that judges in a court should be appointed by the people, with one exception, and that is Sefer Dvarim, which says, Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol sha'arecha. The Torah does not say that judges should be appointed by other judges, or by kings, or by priests, or by prophets, but by the people themselves. This is one example of about 6 or 7 things about political office and political power where the Torah light years ahead of its time.
We're always coming to the end of our broadcast, but I just want to end with one final question that I think to me sums up a lot of what you've been saying and what you've been teaching for many, many years, which is about the next generation. We are now of a generation that has been brought up on smartphones, a very different way of looking at the world than even my generation in terms of who grew up in the 70s and 80s. What do you feel is the biggest challenge we have in Jewish education going forward in terms of educating the next generation? And what do you feel, as you know, is the educationally is the way we should be educating the next generation in terms of Torah?
Oh my, that's a really good question. I'll just say one thing, and it's borne out, at least in my own experience, in my own home, and that is children are going to be exposed to everything.
Oh, you're fading. I want to hear this answer.
Children are going to be exposed to everything. That's our reality, and we cannot build walls because the walls don't work anymore.
Yeah.
And therefore, it is so important to give them maximum to sort out who they are and who they want to be. And it puts the pressure on us as parents to be the best model we possibly can. And to avoid, I would say, as much as possible, saying, no, you can't do that, you can't watch that. It doesn't work anymore. And to do a better job instead of how can I show my child to who they are, really care about their lives, at the same time modeling their own behavior, what it means to be Hashem, what it means to be Yerushalayim. I think that's at least
just in case anyone didn't hear, because you were cutting out, just to say that I think the answer that Rabbi Berman was saying, people didn't hear, was that nowadays we cannot say you can't do this, can't do that. The rules are not going to work anymore. It's about sort of giving the tools to deal with the modern world. And I think therefore makes obvious sense that every bar mitzvah boy and bar mitzvah girl should get Ani Maamin as their bar mitzvah gift to get into as well. But also I think the title you gave it, Ani Maamin, obviously it does deal with the Rambam. But in many ways, the Rambam is the paradigm of somebody who recognized in his time that we needed to do things differently. We had to raise the next generation in a way that really allowed them in this printing press age and everything else. I think today we're in a similar situation. We have a radical change in how the world has happened the last sort of 10, 15 years. We need to have the tools to deal with that. And I think what you have done with this book and your work as well beyond this book is really giving us the tools to know how to confidently walk forward in this world as Torah Jews, but also walk forward as modern, scholarly, intelligent, rational beings that see no contradiction between living a life of Torah and living a life of rational, scientific thought and scholarship. So thank you for tonight. It was really sort of wonderful for me to hear from you, having read the book and now actually getting to answer those questions. And please, I just wish you all the success as you continue to write and teach. And obviously thank Cohen Publishers for tonight's lecture. And to say that next week we've got Rabbi Shlomo Brody is going to be joining me, author of a guide to the complex contemporary halachic debates. I didn't even get into the whole halacha chapter you did, which is fascinating. I thought I'd wait for Rabbi Brody next week. And his title will be about that. Do doctors have a duty to serve during a pandemic? So, of course, again, how halacha l'maaseh can be very relevant to the 21st century. So thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Berman, for joining us tonight. I said it's now 11:15 for you, so thank you for staying up so late. And please, everyone, join us next week for another wonderful discussion. And hopefully, as I said, Rabbi Brody will be intriguing us with that halachic discussion next week. So until next week, have a very good evening, and thank you, and good night.